Hello, I'm Grant Littlejohn, International Project Manager at Stowe Werkstatt. I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's panel discussion, Creative Facades Responding to Context and Culture, which will look how we can use creative facades to literally render a building relevant to its place, its time and use. We are pleased to be involved in tonight's event, but first, a little bit about Stowe Werkstatt. We are Resource Inspiration. We support architects, designers, acousticians with a range of sample, specification and consultation services. At Stowe Werkstatt, we support creativity and embrace new technology. Our augmented reality models of systems and our digital materials library help architects and designers bring their ideas to life. So, what is a facade? Well, obviously it's a crucial physical component of a building. A facade's contribution to a structure goes far beyond that. A facade brings the building to life. It sets the tone and atmosphere well before you enter. Through detailed form, texture, colour and material composition, a facade visually defines a building, shaping people's experience of the place. Meanwhile, technological innovations bring design concepts to life, helping designers achieve the desired look for a building. We have three themes for tonight's discussion. At the end, there'll be a question and answer session, so I'd encourage you to send over any questions you may have for our panellists' consideration. Tonight's themes are: how can creative facade respond to context, climate and artistic vision? How can facade design celebrate the past in order to reimagine the future? And how has technological innovation enabled us to push the boundaries of facade design? I'd like to make my own take on these. Quite simply, there is no one single standard solution. Different locations and conditions such as climate, air quality, pollution levels, aesthetics, history and culture require different considerations. This is reflected in our own thinking of product development. Stowe's global reach combined with our local knowledge and experience means we can support architects and facade engineers worldwide, making intelligent, bespoke decisions for their project, whatever challenges they face. We're delighted you can join us for tonight's discussion. Over to our chair, curator, author and critic, Beatrice Galley.
Hello, good morning from London and good morning from New York and good afternoon in London. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for including me in this discussion or this conversation that we're going to have, which will be discussing facade design and technology. I think that all of us see firsthand the role of facades in city making and the decisions that architects, engineers and clients ultimately make when they choose a facade has a huge impact on the street life, on people's relationship to the building. For me personally, as a curator, you know, when I look at a building for the first time, I have to say that I consider the role of the architect and the client in their values, and I see that when people build, they build their values, and the facade is a hugely important manifestation of those values. They breathe, you know, they communicate, and I think it's interesting that the facade has become a metaphor for something flimsy, you know, or a fake or a front, when in many ways they're one of the most powerful sort of symbols that architecture holds in terms of its communication to the general public. They mediate, they isolate, they manage light, they're often part of the structural design, the climate design, the engineering. So today we're going to be talking about solutions, creativity, the ethics of reuse and adaptation, radical new designs, and the extraordinary progress that the architecture community has been making on reducing architecture's carbon footprint. We have a really lovely and interesting group of designers here today. Some are used to more city-scale design, others working on facades as part of adaptive reuse. Some are working with fascinating innovations in technology, fabrication, combining facade with structure. I'm going to introduce everybody individually. First, I'm going to introduce Valeria Segovia, who is studio director and principal at Gensler in London. So Valeria is going to be talking about her work reinventing the unique but obsolete brutalist building designed by Richard Seifert in Covent Garden, and her work in tying the relationship between the building and the street using the facade. We have also Nick Jackson here, who's a director at Arup Architecture. Before that, he was at Eric Parry, and he'll be reflecting on his work at Triton Square, where a building that has been somehow, and which I'm going to find out about more, has managed to save more carbon in design and construction than it will produce in its 20-year lease. And finally, I'm super happy to have here Arthur Manu Mani, whose extraordinary designs have made him recognized as a RIBA Young Rising Star amongst many other awards. And many of you will know his work from the spectacular installation that he made at Burning Man, experimenting with timber trusses to make a beautiful spiral installation. So without further ado, I'm going to start the conversation, and what we'll try and do is just keep it moving between the three of you. Valeria, I would love to start with you and hear a little bit about the work that you've been doing and your relationship and role in creating an adaptive reuse project with a brutalist building, famously very little glass and very little light in a Seaford project. So could you share a little bit about that, and then maybe each of you could reflect a little bit on architecture and facades role with adaptive reuse.
Yes, absolutely. Hi, Beatrice. Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. This particular project has been the ride to develop the design and the narrative has been fascinating. So we're talking about a building that has it was purposefully built to be a financial institution that negates its context. It's inward looking, it's protective, it's very solid, and has all the characteristics of brutalism, the good ones, amazing ones, and the bad ones. There's a lot of articulation and depth and shadows and beautiful concrete. But there's also a lot of obstacles for the public to access the building, from moats, changes of levels, and literally solid facades. So when our client came to us with the challenge, it was about how do we make this building relevant again? What is going to be what opens up this building to everybody wanting to be in this building? And the key thing about it has been to make it porous, to make it accessible again, with the idea of the ethos of the whole project will be to keeping the structure, to keeping as much as possible. So 80% of the building is kept intact. And with some interventions of certain volumes that are inserted, we managed to change the inside and heal the inside. Now, in terms of the facade, it's all been about mediating a lot of different points that create tension. So number one is, how do you respect the articulation of the building itself, that, you know, it has rigor, it has a lot of grids, it has articulation. How do you also answer the question from the tenant's perspective of wanting to have as much glass as possible, wanting to enjoy views in Covent Garden, sitting in the heart of Covent Garden? And at the same time, how do you break down the scale of a really big building? So this has been the challenge. It's been the facade has been the protagonist of all of this, also knowing that, you know, there's targets in terms of solar gain that we needed to do. So it's been a balancing act of, you know, following rigorous grids and adding layers on the facade to prevent the direct sun to come in, but also not too solid. So there's some louvered elements as well that allow the views to go out. And at the same time, you know, respect the scale of Covent Garden. Covent Garden has a lot of beautiful layers of past and history. It's also very orientated to the human scale. So everything that is big, that is commercial, it doesn't sit very well with Covent Garden, and this is a big commercial building. So it's about translating some of those geometric moves to sit well in Covent Garden and adapt to Covent Garden. So context, solar gain, and the relationship between the inside, so the user experience from the inside and the outside has been the main focus of the project.
Thanks, Valeria. It sounds super interesting, and it's such a shame that I can't be there because of global travel bans, but hopefully I'll be able to stop by next time I'm in New York. Nick, I wondered if you could pick it up. I know that your project is it's not necessarily adaptive reuse, but maybe you could speak a little bit to the topics that Valeria picked up.
Well, I think it's interesting that on a panel like this, you've got both Valeria and ourselves sitting there discussing buildings that are about retrofit and about taking existing conditions in the city and renewing them and transforming them and addressing how a building may or may not work with the context that's evolved. You know, when the Seaford building was built, Covent Garden was a very different place. The building we've been working on at 1 Triton Square for British Land up at Regent's Place, very similar scenario, built in the early 90s for a big bank. It was a very introverted building in the sense that it was a trading building, and it equally was sort of hermetic and self-contained. And in a way, when you think about what you're doing when you design a facade, that's sort of all the things you know, that's sort of counterintuitive to the idea of a facade as being a mediation between interior and exterior and its relationship to the sort of public realm and the context of the city as a whole. And I think we face some very similar challenges that sort of at a design level as an architect, you're sitting there saying, how do we turn a building that is a bit squat and dumpy in its current context, doesn't really engage with the public space around it, doesn't really address entrance and interaction, and transform all of those things. And those are all very subtle, intricate moves you have to make as an architect. And they're very different from what you're doing when you start with a tabula rasa in a new building, where actually there's much bigger gestures you sometimes get preoccupied with. The sort of working with an existing building is almost like surgery in a way, on the one hand. From our point of view, the other piece of the jigsaw that came to working with an existing building is an increasing issue that I think we all face around climate change, and that before we consider we are going to move on and demolish a building, we have to look at what the value and the inherent qualities of the existing building are and whether we can reuse it. And, you know, that there's commercial issues for that in lots of city centres. London is, I think, well down that journey. I think other cities in the world are seeing that becoming an increasing part of day-to-day practice for developer and architect. What the carbon content of the existing building was, and then looking at how we could reduce the carbon footprint of the developed building going forward. And our benchmark, you made reference to at the beginning there about the building will has saved more carbon than it will use in the first 20 years of its life. So that is a benchmark we've developed in terms of analyzing the carbon content of the developed building and comparing it with a new building and going, what's the difference? And then looking at how much energy it uses. And we try to be very transparent with that, and we publish quite a lot of data on that, because we think as an industry, we all need to be thinking about the material content of a building. From the point of view of facade and design, what we did on the building, which was quite unique, is we took 3,000 meters of facade off and refurbished them elsewhere and brought them back to the building in a renewed state, and then integrated them into the overall facade design so that we added and complemented and wove that into a sort of tapestry of different facade devices to create a whole that made sense of the new scale and massing and worked in its urban setting. So it's a sort of set of tactics, if you like, we brought to bear on that.
I mean, I think it's very interesting that the Pritzker Prize winners this year, Lacaton Vassal, are really the champions of adaptive reuse, and I think more and more we'll see the type of innovation and creativity that you both are talking about going extremely. I mean, you both have some of the biggest offices in the world, so you know, the fact that you're leading the way, I think hopefully will encourage others also to think tactically and creatively with these types of adaptive reuse projects, with the type of ethics and issues that you're raising.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, Arthur, we're enablers for that.
Right. Sorry. Yes, there's a slight time lag. You are, and Valeria. Actually, I just wanted to follow up on one of the points that you made when you approached the building, the Seaford building. Was there was there a material choice that you had to make while you were doing that? Was it naturally always going to be glass? Oh, I can't hear Valeria.
Yeah, she's muted.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes.
Yes.
I think this point was one of the things that was fascinating about the process, because this is where context comes to play. All cities have regulatory environments that are different. In London, our planning system is, it forms a very important part of the design. So being in Covent Garden in Westminster, we had to have a dialogue with the borough in terms of their thoughts and what they thought was best for the building as well. So we had on the one hand, the client that had the experience of building in America a lot of wonderful buildings that are all glass buildings, and on the other side we have the council saying this needs to have a certain level of solidity, and we also have the balancing act of it needs to have certain requirements to shade for solar shading. So it was balancing that out, and the material that we started with actually was glass and metal, and the dialogue and the whole design was transformed as we started to evaluate some metrics from creating some different orientation of certain parts of the facade itself and depth for shading, but also to make it harmonious with the existing building. So concrete is the material of the existing building, and we chose concrete. And we're actually, at the moment as we speak, we're getting all the samples together to do mock-ups to match the concrete as much as possible. It's a very different facade, very different geometry, but matching the concrete is something that is going to be very important to respect the history of the building. So it was a very interesting, collaborative approach with the council, the client, and obviously having in mind what was going to resonate with tenants and with the building users as an experience.
Thanks so much, Valeria. Arthur, I would love to bring you into this discussion. Your practice is definitely on a different trajectory or a different scale, let's say, right now. But would love to hear you speak about your use of materials and your relationship to facades and making with architecture at the moment.
Yeah, with pleasure. There's a few things that I really enjoyed hearing Valeria and Nick on. The one is the porosity. Like you mentioned that facades were often. You talked about the Brutalist building where it's like you're either in or out. But really, now that we're speaking about inclusion and inviting people, the facade needs to re-question itself in that sense as being the interface, like sort of responsible for this inclusion or not. And when we worked on you mentioned that project that we worked on, Galaxia, which was really just a giant sponge. And it's a temple, so it was a secular temple in the desert. So not quite the sort of architecture riffit. We started from a desert, literally, but it was still very much an exercise in inviting people into a space of spirituality that wasn't prescribed or didn't impose anything to people. And so in that sense, it was really designed as a sort of giant sponge. And we planned to have a facade on it, a roof. But we actually never, we took it out because we realized that actually the structure acted as this interface. And it was much more inviting to leave it, let's say, open-ended, strangely enough. The structure and the facade merged into this one integral structure. The other thing is on material, I guess, because we're a slightly smaller studio, we're able to take a tiny bit more risk. And one thing we do all the time is to try new materials. And we combine them with our printers. We have, you probably cannot see behind me, there is like an entire fabrication space, the FabPub. And that means we can actually 3D print components and modules using new materials that we can actually insert inside the funnels. And so lately we've been experimenting with this bioplastic made of fermented sugar. And I don't know if you can see the gradients, but we're using the virgin bioplastic made from the fermented sugar, and then slowly switching to different additives, natural additives like wood, like castor bean oil, all kinds of natural elements that we can play with. This includes boring things like fire retardant or UV stabilizer or stuff like that to make it facade friendly. But it's been really interesting to see what could be. We talked about permanence, but these materials are biodegradable. And so it sort of enters the world of what happens if a building could be edible or slowly decompose. Maybe that's another discussion to open up, but
I love that you brought props, Arthur. That is so awesome.
Of course.
It really helps. It's so interesting to see the type of innovation that is happening in architecture studios now. It's almost it's almost like some sort of a cooking show combined with a fab lab inside the office now. It's quite amazing and very interesting to see that. I also have seen increasingly people interested in trying to find ways to reduce the impact of a building and maybe considering that the lifespan is something that can be factored in, maybe like either extreme permanence or extreme temporality, which I think is a kind of an interesting paradox for architects. Nick, I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about the premise of your building in Triton Square, because I think that so many different components of climate change are bearing down on us, and I think not least the rising temperatures, of course, in the UK, and the role of the facade as a kind of mediator of heat, but also as a absorber of carbon from the entire manufacturing process. So there's many different forces, I would imagine, that play into your decision when you're making decisions around what you're going to be building with and what you're going to be using for the facade. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to those design forces from an engineering perspective, but also from a creative perspective too.
Yeah, I mean, well, maybe to follow the theme of what Arthur was talking about in terms of the sort of, the ephemeral qualities of material, I think it's really interesting if you think what we see as the constituent parts of facades and what sort of our practices in the way of thinking about that. And you hear the sort of descriptions going on about layers and that the facade has got a sort of a depth that you can penetrate and so on. And, in classical architecture, that was done through a whole series of sort of, very physical devices within the carving of a if you look at a Borromini facade or whatever, it's a highly layered structure. It's all predominantly made of one material, but actually there's a whole series of sort of games going on that allow you to penetrate the building and do that mediation. What Arthur's talking about in terms of talking about the physicality of the material and the qualities of it, and then sculptural qualities, is doing exactly the same. And I think what we have seen going on in the building, so the building we've been working with was a very early example of a layered facade that had a triple facade with an inner double glaze and an outer layer and a whole system of pieces of metal that supported the two to create this highly controllable sort of envelope that was it was conceived primarily as an environmental treatment about how to get maximum lighting, control heat load, and so on. And we're now doing that in design. If you talk to people like Gartner, they're doing that within a zone that they can do in 250 millimeters. That back in the world of Pompidou does it, and what we're doing at Triton to do that. The crucial thing, though, I think that comes into that sort of question of temporary and permanent is more to do with circularity and the ability to dismantle and reuse and repurpose. So the reason we saved a lot of carbon on Triton was we were able to actually take pieces of glass off because it was assembled in a very simple physical, mechanical way. We could clean stuff, replace gaskets, put the same pieces of glass back on the building. that could have just as easily been a piece of 3D printed material that maybe needed to be taken off to be cleaned or to be stabilized. That could have been put back on. A stone is just, stone is wonderful because it's all, it's organic, but it has amazing durability if you get the right pieces of stone. So, as we use material in the way we make buildings, I think we have a responsibility to be thinking in a very innovative way about how we put them together and assemble them, but that we all are thinking at the same time about how they might get repurposed further down the line. And the same goes for the design of the building as a whole. I mean, we think we're designing an office building, but we don't really know whether actually it's going to turn into a laboratory building or a hotel, or somebody's going to live in it. And what are the adaptations you might make to it? What is a library one day may become another thing another day. And that sort of non-specific quality of thinking architecturally about space and environment and how buildings sit in the city, I think is increasingly, we're dealing with built stock that has got to last a long time, really. The agenda is shifting, and I think for students studying architecture now, that agenda is starting to shift very much from where we all sat when we went through education.
Arthur, you have another prop. I've seen.
Yeah, there's never too many props. No, it's really interesting. It's really interesting what you're mentioning about permanence. And right now, I guess because we come from the world of sort of temporary and pop-up, and the reason we're from that world is because when I studied at the AA at the time, the Fab Labs could only print small things, could only laser cut small things, and slowly. And I remember coming to Arup actually and not squatting your laser cutter because we were doing an installation together for a shop window. But what happened is that the printers got much bigger, the laser cutting machine got much bigger, and the materials slowly also, the question of circularity came in, the idea that we could potentially use these materials at the full scale. But then came the question of innovation and risking it, because the legislation, the regulations were not, like, they didn't know, like 3D printing a new kind of facade, like it's not in the building regulations. And it's risky because no one has done it. And so it sort of opens up a whole conversation about the bespoke and the sort of custom made. And the reason I brought this prop here is because this is a piece of coral washed ashore and not taken from the ocean. And it's got all these different branches. And the reason I'm showing it is because nature has a tendency to adapt to the conditions very specifically to where it is. And learn from the places that it grows. And when you think of things like, I don't know, ducts or systems that grow on a facade, or its reaction to the sun or to itself or to the wind, right now we just order materials from the suppliers and things like that. And I think there is a sort of new world in which we can actually customize things for specific location, and maybe that's the sort of new era in which we're going to create with new machines for bespoke places, for really specific conditions, a new thing for each one of those buildings. And I find this really exciting because it sort of opens up this whole idea that nothing will be repetitive, that everything will be really, really crafted to its own territory, and sorry, I went in a bit of a tangent with my prop, but
But Arthur, I find that subject fascinating in terms of innovation, because we recently had an internal competition against Laird design competition, and one of the submissions was a machine that builds the building. So I think we're talking now about, how do we integrate fabrication and use, or fabrication and services? Because everything is so much more about curating things for responding to user experience. And it's very difficult to now divide things in parts or in typologies. There's this everything happens everywhere. that is, it's fascinating. And now thinking about things that can build the building. So how do we make those things better? I think it's a fascinating subject, actually.
That builds and unbuild the building. I think that's the thing that needs a little bit of a switch in our brain, is that I was talking about nature and how it washes ashore and dies when it's not needed and then is reborn somewhere else. We often build our buildings just thinking, of that. We don't think of eventually it'll have to go down. No matter where, I mean, unless it's some ruin that will happen for thousands of years, but even that is a problem in terms of the circular economy. And so the machine that builds need to also know when to unbuild, or the materials we use need to be thought as something that will eventually be recycled or disassembled or composted. And so there's a lot of research in that world of cradle to cradle buildings, coming from the earth, going back to the earth, or repurposed for something else. I mean, we know the shipping containers, for example, are a good example of that. But I mean, that was just sort of a de facto thing that people did because they just existed. But what if we invented new kinds of shipping containers that are compostable, or in that sense?
Yeah, but I think the other part is to see it's in a way it's a mistake to see a building as a single sort of organism in a way. It's like a body. It's got a skeleton. It's got a structure. It then has, a whole series of layers and elements that go to it. If you think of what people do with, the custom cars, say, where you take the skeleton of the car and then it adapts and changes. In a way, you could approach buildings in the same way, that the future adaptation of them and the sort of transformation, their ability to morph. That I think is sort of interesting. If you look at some of the things that have gone on around, repurposing things like shopping centers or whatever, where they've been stripped back to just a frame, you adapt them, it becomes a bit of public space. Then maybe in 20 years' time, it changes again. Urban farms being introduced. We've got a lot of work we're doing around some of these big sort of mega structures that are built as, like a shopping mall, that are built as a single entity, as a bit of a monoculture. And then you realize that they've been inserted into town centers, and they're sort of, they serve a purpose for a time, and then actually we realize life is richer and more diverse than that. How do you then dismantle that? You can't just wipe it away. You have to see how you can transform and sort of, modulate it in a way. And I think that's where, the sort of organic nature of transformation is really interesting. And therefore the sort of thinking about, well, what constitutes the classic reading of a building? I've got a structure, I've got a skin, and so on. It's much more complex than that, I think, going forward, is what we're finding.
Yes, actually, one of the projects in my book uses hempcrete, which the architects grew the hemp as part of the life cycle of the building process. So they were able to grow the hemp and then also sort of create the hempcrete panel facades, so that the whole process itself was sort of under in the same space. There was no embodied carbon sort of bringing things in and out, and the prefabricated panels could all be made on site. And I do think that, to Arthur's point, that we do have to think quite clearly about the entire process of the building, in the sense that if we're building machines to build building parts, we have to build those machines, and those machines have to come from somewhere, and those materials have to come from somewhere to build the machines, to build the other materials. So when we're thinking about the whole life cycle, we also have to incorporate manufacturing, transportation, and she said shipping containers. How can we improve the whole process, like what's really into every single aspect of the architecture.
It's very hard and strange process, and I'm so blessed that we have clients that can understand that. And the latest was, they said, well, should we do a vertical farm where we're going to do our building, because we need to produce the plastic? And then if we have the vertical farm, should we have the composting facility? And then the dialogue starts from the crops and goes all the way to the earth that then goes back to the crop. And so this we're working on a sort of a big center that has all of these elements. And the more we talk, the more we realize that if we want things to be local, you need a space for the machines, you need a space for and it's quite amazing to open up that conversation, because it's completely beyond the realm of an architect. Like, we have material scientists involved, we have even the retail person who's doing the retail experience has to think about that. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's an ecosystem in that sense, isn't it? I mean, that is really what you're describing, which in a way the city is, but it's how we harness that. And I think the sort of, your comment in a way, Beatrice, alludes back to the point about, the specificity of location and locality and everything that comes with that in terms of, what a building is engaging with. Part of that is climate. Part of that obviously is climate in its physical manifestations of sun and heat and so on. But a lot of it is also to do with its context, that, the architecture of most cities is deeply rooted in its geology and, it's urban, it's a sort of agricultural hinterland in a way.
Yeah, that's right. Actually, that is an excellent segue into my next topic, which was we're actually going to move into audience questions shortly. But I did want to pick up on this on the idea of context specifically, and how, and that sort of knitting together, of the fabric of a city through the facade. That is maybe a more classical approach to understanding what a facade could be, but how does the history and the context of the site inform your creative process and your decision-making process? And then I'm going to tap on a slightly tangential underlying question, which is also, what if the context is something less tangible, such as COVID, or such as, health? So what if the context is that maybe there'll be less office workers inside, or maybe there will be a need for more airflow, or a sort of, how do those different, what does context mean now? Is it changing? And how does that inform your decision making? Maybe Valeria, you could start.
Yes, absolutely. And, I think there's a big part of the conversation when it comes to context is user experience. Oh, there's so much background noise. There's user experience. And so I think a very good example about on this is when it comes to, let's say, a person walking on the street, they always want to relate to something. So if it's, beautiful greenery on the street, or if it's the building that is right next to you, so being able to see through or to touch the bricks, or to, see a little bit of green growing out from the bricks. So there's always something about the interaction from a human, from a person to its physical form, that I think it really makes everything so tangible. And that's why we see that when buildings expire, is very often, okay, it's about services and the things falling apart or whatever, but it's also about the relationship with the inside and the outside. So if buildings are too solid, or if buildings negate its context, or very inward looking, it becomes a little bit of an unknown. So I think there's something about purpose that is very important in terms of context, and having the why. Why are you there? How are you relating to, as a building? How does the building relate to across the road, or how it relates to passing or entering? And so it's very much about tuning into the experience rather than the physicality itself. And I think to the other point on what if the context is a little bit less tangible, such as tangible COVID. I think it touches also on some of the things that were brought up before, that is adaptability. You know, we are so ever changing as humans. We change all the time. And buildings are the last thing to change because they're so static. So I think there's a big part of innovation that it really is about flexibility. Flexibility with always a sense of place and authenticity. So I think this is where the relationship with flexibility and context is so important and fascinating, which sometimes oppose.
Arthur, you want to pick it up?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I guess I could jump in. It's context is so multi-layered because you could see it as the more environmental, universal context, or the resistance of a material, of how a material wants to behave and stuff. It is to some extent a context, but there is then the more ethereal one, which is the culture. The setup, the values of a place, and this is really, really hard. And it turns the architect into a listener, someone who can has an infinite curiosity that, in a way, like it makes us. It's things that you hardly can learn, but that is so crucial to it. Like I think behind me, for example, I have a screen that we're 3D printing, and it's based on the traditional Arabic patterns. And then once you open up that topic, you're like, wow, which pattern from where and where was? And then there's a history, and then there's an archaeology of like what, and things are never. How can I say, easy. People will look into it and say, oh, this reminds me of the thing that I saw, and then people have an infinite culture as well, and and that is a role of the architect that we especially in a technological age, especially where we think that, I don't know, robots will save us, or that parametric design, let's say in our case, and I tend to kind of say, well, no, it's like we have a responsibility to know more deeply the historical and cultural place, and so that we don't impose ourselves to people or impose concepts that are superficial, a facade can be superficial to some extent, and that depth that we talked is also a cultural depth.
I think that's really beautifully put. I mean, I studied architecture under Dalibor Vesely, and the whole sort of understanding of the sort of phenomenology of the city and so on, and what you refer to in terms of memory and how the city, sort of the meaning of city is constituted in the manifestation in the buildings, I think is as relevant now as it was in sort of Baroque or Renaissance. I mean, Beatrice, you talk about sort of classical sort of story in a way. I think actually what we're really talking about is sort of the nature of buildings create a setting or a situation for life to go on, really, and that's what we do now just as much as one was doing in Rome, in the 15th century. And that, in a way, as an architect, we have a deep responsibility to society, when we're in a very privileged position of creating a building, is to create something that is accessible, is about an opening up of opportunity for people, and it's not an edifice of our own sort of a mark we're trying to leave. In a way, it's something much more powerful than that.
That's a very beautiful point, both of you. Thanks for bringing us down to land our conversation in this very, very sort of profound role of architecture and what we all hope to contribute in our ways. We're going to move to audience questions now, and I would encourage everyone who's watching, if they would like to send a question, now is your time to squeeze some more information out of these lovely people. We have a couple already. How difficult is it to communicate ideas like circular economy, materiality with commissioners and property developers? I guess yes, we could. who would like to pick on that? Is it
I'm
is it
happy to
architects'
pick
role
that
as
up.
champions, or are you also receiving that direction from the property developers and clients?
You know, I think this is the perfect question to talk a little bit about the responsibility that the industry has to work together. Because, you know, there is a big challenge on climate change that we all have to do, and there is no way that just the architect or just the engineer or just the client can do it without the whole industry being on the same page. And I would say even like not that far, like 2 years ago, it was a big ask to ask the client, oh, can we actually study this, or could we compromise program for the benefit of circular economy? Or I think now that the picture is changing very, very fast, and I think developers are starting to, you know, to be the first ones that tell you this is the vision of the project. We need as negative carbon, etc. So I think it's changing. It's changing very, very fast, and it's very inspiring. Actually, we see in particular developer clients that are experienced tend to be very knowledgeable.
That's encouraging.
Yeah,
Is that the case also for you, Nick?
Yeah, I would agree. I think the issues are on the table at the beginning of a project now. Ideally, they should be almost the first things you're discussing when you start that conversation with any client around any project. You know, we have a very clear opening with what is going on in the wider world to put that on the table. And the data is there that we're able to harness. But as architects, if you like, we initiate the vision of a project. We have to embed it into the thinking and not see it as a sort of bolt on. Oh yeah, no, that's another bit I put into it. Doesn't need to be central to the thinking. I would add to what Valeria has just said is that actually the funders are moving very quickly in that space, and sort of the whole sense of where tenant and funders are sitting is, if that's not on the table in a sort of commercial project, certainly, then you're very quickly going to find yourself in a difficult place. Given these buildings take, you know, anywhere between 5, 7, 8 years to go from first conversations to being completed, you're in a very dangerous space if you're developing something now and you haven't really got a story going on about your carbon strategy. You're not aiming for the highest environmental credentials you can achieve, and that you're really not pushing that hard. And if it's not hard, you're not doing it well enough. If the conversation isn't difficult, you're just not really scratching the surface, I think is the truth, like many things.
Maybe I could jump in, because that's something we take really much at heart. And you know, we know us that there is about 10 or 9 to 10 years left to readjust to the 1.5 degree like limit, beyond which, so it's sort of that serious. And when we talk to our client, hello, are you still hearing me?
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah.
I saw a bit of a freeze. Yes. Okay, fantastic. So once this emergency is clear, the client can kind of be on your side or be like, ooh, I'm not quite sure. And when you hear that doubt, then it's a bad sign. But I've never heard that doubt. What can happen though is that it's a very superficial greenwashing, and that needs to be dug a little bit deeper. And the way you do this is you give choices. For example, when you use plastic, you know, I don't know, you use a material like bamboo on the floor, and you start digging into it. And it's like, what's the resin that binds it? And then the bamboo company will say, oh, it's epoxy. And then you're like, well, wait a second. So you're making me use bamboo, yet you're making me bind it with a petroleum-based plastic. What is that all about? That's not quite green. Mm-hmm. Because sustainability means that it can sustain itself, means you're using renewables. And when you question that, they're like, oh, no one asked me. Everyone thought, you know, because we're an eco product, it means that we are eco. And you don't question the fact that but actually once you start scratching surface, and that's really what we should start doing beyond just saying we're going to follow the BREEAM and the LEEDs, is actually digging into all the products and really be our own Sherlock Holmes. And you'll see that it's a really interesting quest. And I cannot think of anyone who doesn't enjoy that quest and that challenge, from the clients to the even the contractors, because they feel like they're helping and that they're quote unquote saving the planet together with us. So if you bring them to that journey and everyone feels part of that journey, it becomes a common challenge and it becomes a purposeful thing. And Valeria, you spoke about the why, and that gives a strong why to everything that we're doing. And everyone is on board, because no one is no one is an asshole. Excuse my French.
It's always what we're looking for. That's so interesting, Arthur. I really like that idea of the investigation that we actually are responsible for making decisions. Like, part of that decision-making process has to be being informed. And I think that we have at the tip of our fingertips, right, everything, right? We can find out pretty much anything about any material and the life cycle of it if we try hard enough. So I think that's a really interesting and important message. I would imagine. We have a couple more questions from the audience. How has the experience of the past year influenced how you think about designing in an urban context? I guess you can also think about other contexts, but how has the last year affected your own sort of design practice, if it has at all? Nick?
I think at a day-to-day level, it's been interesting, just because actually the working with a team and a studio, and you realize how valuable sharing a space and a piece of paper and a model and so on is. I mean, we can share lots of graphical things, but actually I look at Arthur's backdrop with great jealousy. I've been in our offices when I can, but that sort of just getting hold of stuff has been hard. So at the level of practice, it's been difficult. Some things have been amazing. We found sort of the virtual world actually has flattened a lot of conversations in terms of hierarchy, and it opens up a much more democratic level to debate and interactions. And we've had some really interesting sessions where we've, the whole team have been able to contribute to a conversation around design crits and so on, and get people involved in things that are actually much harder in different contexts. So to inform that's been very thought-provoking, I think, in many ways. At the level of design, in terms of what we're doing for clients, I think there's much more uncertainty about what the program of buildings might be, and people see the sort of the type of the typologies or the segregation of different types of activity that maybe conventionally has gone on has become much more blurred. We realize we use spaces in a much more dynamic way, and I think part of that is the ability that we've all discovered in 18 months to digitally communicate from pretty much anywhere in a really effective visual way suddenly opens up what you can do anywhere. You can be, I go for a walk up on the common and I can be having this conversation. I can sit and discuss a design with somebody. That means I can work in different places. They can work in different places, and therefore what the city is and how you come together is changed. So I think we're only just scratching the surface of what it means. So the simple conversation around COVID workplace is going to transform itself into something much more interesting in terms of how we read the spatial sort of topography of the city, I think.
But, I think there's a lot of things that are very interesting that have emerged. I think we took our offices home for over a year, a lot of people. And I think there is this sense of, okay, there's been certain things that haven't worked, that have been challenging, but there is this sense of also people wanting to bring a little bit of home to the workplace. So everything that feels a little bit more like you have certain level of control of your environment. So you can open the window, you can, have certain things that you can relate to visually, which reminds you a little bit of home. If you can have a space for coffee and for lunch, and things like that are softer, kinder for humans, are the things that have inspired us and that somehow have kept us going. So I think there's this balancing act about the work and home that is now starting to blur the boundaries in a very kind of meaningful way. The other area that's been fascinating to see is the change in retail. When the whole COVID pandemic lockdown started in the world, I think the numbers for retail online shopping went up crazy, and everybody, I think all the retailers were afraid of what's going to be when we open up. And I think the need of people going to touch things and to see things is so strong that, you know, the numbers have been surprisingly high. So you know, the human interaction and the need for people to fulfill the need of enriching the senses is huge, and I think that's been, you know, so inspirational to see. Not only in design and in architecture, because at the end of the day, I really think that design is everywhere. But as you know, what happens to the world and to humans.
That's the touching of things. This is something that is really the biggest change for us. Of what we realize is our dependency to outside places for materials and for, I don't know if you saw, there's a spike of 30% in all materials, and we realized how dependent we were from the outside world and how little we were producing locally. And this was like I don't know if you remember this big shipping container boat that was stuck in, and then we realized that the arteries of the world and how like global everything was. And when we came back to the studio, we realized that this idea of producing locally was so crucial. We started making masks for the NHS during the crisis because there was we didn't have enough of those masks. So all the machines, and it was beautiful how all the maker spaces and Fab Labs and architecture studio realized that they had factories in their offices. And so we now moved to a huge hangar because we realized that as well as designers, we need to also make. And somehow the COVID accelerated that switch to become makers and contractors, not just designers, because we realize our dependence. You see, I can't even explain things with all my props, so let alone just me in my flat. So that was the huge change for us, is just how much we needed to be producing locally, and the clients were really on board with that.
Well, I know we could probably all talk for longer and get to know each other and learn more about each other's work and practices. It's been a really enlightening conversation and a pleasure to host this conversation. Thanks to STO Workstart for having us. You have all, I think, shone a light on very different components of architectural practice and working with facades and making and taking responsibility, living through COVID, thinking about life cycles of materials and the ethics of construction, and it's been fascinating. So thank you so much. Hope that everybody at home or in the office also had got something out of it. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much to all of the speakers, Arthur, Nick, and Valeria.
Thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice.
Hi, I'm Nadia Labin. I'm the Materials and Sustainability Consultant for STO here at our International Project Support Hub in Clerkenwell, London. And my focus is materiality and anything regarding sustainability. I'm here at the Materials Library in Clerkenwell in London, where we have a vast range of samples from render, acoustics, insulation systems, 3D cladding, and many more in all sorts of sizes and different variations. We do also have a meeting space here where you can have meetings with your team. Our technical team can join you for those to have in-depth discussion of your projects. You've already met James and Grant earlier. There's also the entire library online on our website, where you can just look at the finishes and coloring that we have. Finally, if you've enjoyed the CPD, please also look at our other CPDs that we have on offer, as well as our mini lecture. They can come to you. We can present them at your office, or you can book them online. Thank you.